Chapter 4. Suspicious Digging. Sitting forward on her chair, Nancy waited eagerly for her father's startling news. He smiled. "I did a little investigating myself today and found out the wryneck was stolen. Can you guess from where?" "Some museum, I suppose," Nancy replied. "But that would not be startling. The bird was taken from the Harper University Museum." "Near the Thurstons' farm?" Mr. Drew nodded. The lawyer's eyes twinkled. "Nancy, you're not the only one who gets hunches. I had one and called several museums until I located the right one. The curator was surprised when I told him the bird had been left here. Nancy, didn't you say that the Eurasian girl who is living with the Thurstons is studying ornithology at Harper University?" Nancy knew at once what her father was thinking. "Surely Cammy didn't steal it from the museum," she exclaimed. "Why, she'd be the last one in the world to do that. She's a dedicated student." Mr. Drew shrugged. "What you say is logical, Nancy, but don't forget that sometimes a person lets superstition and custom take precedence over his good sense. Other people must be tolerant about this." Nancy thought about this comment for several seconds and had to admit that this was an example of her father's wise counseling, which had made him one of the leading attorneys in the state. He changed the subject. "Nancy," he said, "will you please take the wryneck back to the University Museum? I talked with Professor Saunders there and told him I would see that the bird was returned soon." "I'll go first thing tomorrow morning," Nancy replied. "Perhaps Cammy will be there, and I'll have a chance to talk to her." Unfortunately, the Eurasian girl was not at the university the next morning. To Nancy's disappointment, she learned from the registrar that Cammy had no classes all day. Oh well, Nancy sighed and decided to seek out Professor Saunders. He proved to be a very pleasant man and thanked Nancy profusely for returning the stolen wryneck. "I can't understand it," he said. "The only person who has a key to the glass cases besides myself is our maintenance man. He has been here many years and is entirely trustworthy." Nancy suggested that someone might have used a skeleton key. "Have you any idea who?" He shook his head in bewilderment. If a person really wanted to get money for the collection, he would have had to steal many birds. Why he only picked out the wryneck is a mystery to me. "I think it was to jinx us Drews," Nancy replied. "Fortunately, we don't believe in such things. Nevertheless, we'd like to find out who did it. There was no note or any clue to the person who brought it." "That must make you feel a bit uncomfortable," Saunders commented. Nancy asked the professor if he or the maintenance man ever lent their keys to anyone to borrow birds for study or exhibition purposes. "Sometimes I do when I'm too busy to leave my office," he answered, "but only to graduate students, and on occasion other professional ornithologists. I jot down their names and requests. That way I don't have to depend on my memory." "Has anyone asked you in the past week or so for the keys to the cases?" Nancy queried. Professor Saunders thought for a minute, then said, "Yes, 3 graduate students have asked for the keys recently, but all returned them as soon as possible and brought back the birds to me personally." Nancy was puzzled. Someone had apparently removed the mounted wryneck from the case without breaking either the lock or the glass. Who was it, and how did he do it? "Would you mind telling me the names of the students and which birds they borrowed?" she asked. The professor took a notebook from his pocket and flipped the pages. "I see that one boy took a quail. A girl student studied a flycatcher. Oh yes, and one did want the wryneck." "Was it Kamenka?" Nancy asked eagerly, and mentioned her brief introduction to the student. "Yes, but I assure you she returned it. Anyway, what reason would she have for stealing the bird and leaving it on your lawn?" Nancy smiled. I can't figure out a single reason." She was thinking, however, that for some purpose not clear yet, Cammy might have taken the bird out. "But I hate to be suspicious of her," the young detective chided herself silently. "She's a lovely person. I hope she's not mixed up in this jinx business." Nancy followed Professor Saunders to the large room where the mounted birds were on display. She watched him intently as he unlocked the cabinet with the empty perch and put the stuffed wryneck on its little stand. He locked the cabinet again. Nancy noticed that the lock was the kind which could not be opened with a skeleton key. This fact made the removal of the wryneck even more puzzling. As the man turned from the cabinet, a bell rang. He paused, and Nancy knew it was his signal to go to a class. She thanked him and said goodbye. "I think I'll go home by way of the proposed site for the high-rise project," Nancy decided as she drove off. She skirted the Thurston property and parked along a dirt road next to a large open field some distance back of the bird cages. Nancy locked her car and started walking across the field. Presently, she noticed a couple standing about 100 yards away, talking. As she drew closer, Nancy thought, "That's Cammy!" Wondering why the Eurasian girl was out here and who the man was, Nancy hastened toward them. Suddenly, Cammy's companion turned. He and Nancy looked squarely at each other. "He's the man who cut one of Mr. Thurston's cages," Nancy murmured. She started to run after him. At the same instant, the suspect took off at a right angle toward the road. Within a few seconds, he came to a car, jumped in, and sped across the field. Nancy tried to see the license number, but the car was too far away. All this time, Cammy had stood still, looking puzzled. As Nancy ran up to her, the young detective cried out, "Who was that man?" "I don't know. I never saw him before," Cammy replied. "Did he say why he was here?" Nancy queried. "No, he didn't." Cammy went on to explain that the man had told her he was a stranger in town and had asked her for directions to River Heights. "I told him I didn't know." "Was he here when you arrived?" "Yes, he was," Cammy said. "He was walking back from over there." Cammy pointed toward the middle of the field. Nancy looked down and could distinctly see footprints going and returning from some spot. She decided to follow them. Cammy joined her. Nancy was thinking, maybe I'll pick up a clue to his identity or why he was here. To Cammy, she said, "Were you here looking over the site for the housing development?" "Not really," Cammy replied. "I just wanted to take a stroll." They continued to follow the footprints for some distance, and Nancy became more and more curious. She realized that not far ahead was the Thurston farmhouse. An idea came to her. Maybe that wire cutter was going to try it again. Then he saw Cammy coming and didn't dare go on. Cammy kept looking at Nancy curiously and finally said, "I would like to know what you are doing. Do you expect to learn something about the stranger?" "I hope to," Nancy answered. The trail of footprints led the girls to a circular pit. It had been dug recently, but dirt had been shoveled back into it. Nancy stopped and motioned to Cammy to keep from stepping closer. She had noticed there were no footprints beyond the pit. Had the stranger hidden something there? Or was he making some kind of a soil test? She quickly ruled out the latter idea, deciding that the digger would not have needed to dig up so much earth, nor would he have bothered to return it to the same spot. "Nancy, what are you thinking?" Cammy asked. "You certainly are mysterious." The young detective smiled at her companion. "I suppose I am, and I'll admit being suspicious of that stranger's reason for being here." She began to search for a large stone. After finding one, she told Cammy to stand back out of the way. "I'm going to throw this," she said. Nancy heaved it directly into the pit. Seconds later, there was a terrific explosion. Dirt and stones flew in all directions. End of chapter 4.